Hello everyone, my name is Timothy Ryanday. I'm from St. Louis University's Madrid campus, and this paper is Dystopia Now, Richard Powers, The Overstory, and Shakespeare's Macbeth. The marching of Birnam Wood is one of the great paradoxes in Shakespeare's works. At once a symbol of nature's agency and a refutation of the supernatural, firmly rooting the pagan-infused illusion of a pantheistic nature in the mundane human discipline of military strategy. The mystery, ultimately, does not lie in the marching of the wood itself, but in the curious ability of the weird sisters to predict that nature will be manipulated in a way that will offer the appearance of the supernatural. Of course, that very prediction alludes to something beyond nature as we know it empirically. However, the witches provide what is a decidedly anthropomorphic supernatural, one that allows us to glimpse an agency that moves beyond the human, while remaining rooted in the comforting home of the human body. They are both familiar and strange, both human and more than human. The whole of the mystery created by the witch's prediction and the all-too-worldly mechanism that leads to the seeming magic of a marching forest is an uncanny example of what we have come to call nature cultures. It is not surprising, then, that 400 years later, on the other side of the Enlightenment, Richard Powers returns to just this scene from Shakespeare's play as he constructs a text dedicated to the complex and unwieldy juncture of human agency and the agency of nature, particularly our currently unfolding notions of the intelligence of forests, and what that forces us to question about our own cherished notions of the subjective human self. Macbeth is far from unique in Shakespeare's body of work for its exploration of the line between nature and culture. It is a virtual obsession, and one of the primary engines of Shakespeare's sustained ability to engage us across the centuries. Prospero's books are a notable example of human knowledge having the capacity to manipulate the natural world, while the hallucinogenic juice from Puck's flower is an example of nature's capacity to infiltrate and alter human minds and emotions. References to Ovid's Daphne and Titus, or to Midas in The Winter's Tale, or even, as I have argued elsewhere, to the Minotaur in Hamlet, remind the reader that pagan notions of nature are still powerful cultural narratives in Shakespeare's time and our own. For all of our obsession with the subjective self, the scientific method, and modernity in general, our narrative selves are never quite capable of escaping a basic intuition that we might not be as separate as we would like to imagine. Superstition, religion, spirituality, and awe before the sublimity of nature keep coming back to remind us that we are, despite the best efforts of our impressive intellectual and technological selves, completely interwoven with the world in our midst. It is from within this context that Richard Powers invokes Shakespeare repeatedly in his telling 8 stories of how trees move individuals towards activism, of how nature co-opts the willpower of humans to coerce them into doing its bidding, leaving us with the same question that sits at the center of Macbeth. Where does agency really exist, and what does it have to do with the creation of a better world? And maybe more to the point, a better world for whom? For the individual? For humanity as a whole, for the myriad animal species that inhabit the planet, or for the balance of all the forces and beings in the natural world that we have come to refer to as Gaia. Any contemporary notion of utopia must contend with complexity inherent in current understandings of physics, biology, and the neuroscience that weaves itself into our vision of the subjects as it wanes from its position at the center of our approach to nature. Macbeth first appears explicitly in the Overstory in the chapters about Mimi Ma. In 1948, as the communists approached, Mimi's father, Si Swin, a Hui Muslim trader, was forced to escape Shanghai and his father's successful business on Nanjing Road. As his father prepares the young engineering student for his trip to the United States, he gives him 3 jade rings and a scroll. The rings are carved with images of landscapes. His father tells him, quote, "You live between 3 trees. One is behind you, the lot, the tree of life for your Persian ancestors. The tree at the boundary of the 7th heaven that none may pass. Ah, but engineers have no use for the past, do they?" Handing them a second ring, he says, "Another tree stands in front of you. Fusang, a magical mulberry tree, far to the east, where they keep the elixir of life." Finally, he offers him the 3rd ring, saying, "The third tree is all around you. Now, and like now itself, it will follow you wherever you go." After giving the rings, he unrolls a scroll with the images of 3 men. His father tells him that the men are Luohan, Arhat, adepts who have passed through the 4 stages of enlightenment and now live in pure, knowing joy. The three rings and the three odd hats clearly become stand-ins for the wayward sisters. The connection becomes explicit when the elderly Sir becomes obsessed with the Vivaldi opera version of, the Verdi opera version of Macbeth. But here Powers has given them a very different hue. They do not appear tinted with the darkness and witchcraft we tend to associate with sisters, but with wisdom and a spiritually rooted magic that is associated with nature's grandeur and beneficence. Here the witches are wise men, who can have cultivated their spiritual centers, hone their connectivity with the natural world, become enlightened, and as such have wisdom to pass on. This is a radical rereading of the witches from Macbeth. The witches are often connected to a pagan tradition, and thus with the wilderness of the hearth, the wildness of the hearth, but rarely is their witchcraft interpreted as the result of a virtuous relationship to nature. Here the witches' ability to see what Macbeth cannot is not a result of black magic, but meditation and presence, and a sense of being tuned into the messages being communicated from the physical world. It is Macbeth's failure to read the signs all around him that generates his departure from nature's course, and the dramatic rupture in nature. We can infer Macbeth's presence in the novel right from the outset. The novel begins almost biblically. First there was nothing, then there was everything, is the first line of the novel. Then, a paragraph later, after introducing a woman who sits in a park, taking in the nature that is unfolding all around her, a woman that I think we can later assume might be Mimi Ma. Powers writes, "Signals rain down around her like seeds." The chapter that follows the story of Nicholas Hole and his antecedents is a story about seeds that are planted in the trees that grow from them alongside generations of holes. The steady progress of the tree across a century and a half is juxtaposed against the short lives of the holes who watch it grow. All of this calls to mind Banquo's famous line in Macbeth when he speaks to the witches, quote, "If you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not, speak then to me, who neither beg nor fear your favors nor your hate." The metaphor is a clear one. The unfolding of time, of a life, is similar to the unpredictable emergence of a plant from a seed within a complex natural world. Who can say what will happen? But when Powers says that signals rain down around her like seeds, he seems to be saying something different. He's implying that there's a message in the unfolding of nature, that there is a story being told by the seeds and the signals themselves. He's flying in the face of Macbeth's famous line at the end of the tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech, that life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Rather, it is all meaningful in ways that exceed the human capacity or need to understand. There it is all around us, there for us to bask in, enjoy, appreciate, and play with. Of course, Shakespeare's audience was probably already meant to read Macbeth as a character whose relationship to nature was desperately flawed, and as such, we should not take his nihilist rant as truth, rather as a reflection on where his tyrannical bent on power led his own subjective experience. The difference in Powers' version lies more in its attitude towards nature, which is full of mystery, magic, and the constant transmission of signals, but avoids giving in to what Simon Eastock might call ecophobia, or the irrational fear of nature that was endemic to Shakespeare's time, a time in which even the King James, who's a famous proponent of witchcraft and conspiracy theories related to witches, even wrote a book, Demonology, on the dangers presented by witches in society. In Shakespeare's play, the voices of nature follow a Cartesian model, serving principally to bewilder and confuse. Whereas in Powers' novel, the signals coming from the natural world can lead us to balance, if we were willing and able to listen. This is clear nowhere more than when the customs agent opens Hui's trunk upon landing in San Francisco and asks him to unroll the scroll with the painting of the Arhats. "Who are they?" the agent asks Hui. He replies, "Holy people." "What's wrong with them?" she asks. "Happiness. They see the true thing," Hui tells her. She asks him then what the true thing is, and he struggles to put it into words before finally saying, quote, "The true thing mean human beings so small and life so very big." Macbeth's mistake is to take himself, his advancement, too seriously, to think that nature is at all concerned with his progress through hierarchy. The forest will not move to stop him. only humans could deal in such petty time frames. However, this is not to say that nature is not communicating, teaching, playing. It is, and if we listen from a place of humility, we may learn. Macbeth reappears at the scene of Hugh's suicide. He's listening to Verdi's Macbeth as he shoots himself, sitting beneath the mulberry tree that he had planted with his wife years before. There's an ancient poem by Wang Wei unscrolled before him, which reads in part, "An old man, I want only peace. The things of this world mean nothing. I know no good way to live, and I can't stop getting lost in my thoughts, my ancient forests." The poem again calls to mind Macbeth's sound and fury signifying nothing. The old man's mind is full, but the signals are meaningless, or at least beyond his ability to organize into meaningful patterns. He was unable to hear the voices of the Arhats, and instead was led down the path of the witches. Mimi's path through the novel will flirt with the same destruction as she follows the voice that calls to her from nature through trials, anxieties, rages, and even ambition that ultimately proves deadly to some close to her. Her activism is first spurred by the clear-cutting of a forest behind her office. Without realizing it, she associates the forest with the rings, the Arhats, and ultimately her father. Her reaction is emotional and unconscious, and despite her aversion to people with conviction, she finds herself leaping into a movement to protect trees in an old-growth forest. Her increasing dedication to the cause pushes her into a close relationship with the novel's other protagonists, each of whom have been led by some interaction with a tree, either mystical or mundane, to the same project. Their collective zealotry ultimately leads to an act of terrorism, in which Olivia Vandergriff, a young woman who believes she can communicate with trees after a near-death experience on her college campus, who also claims to have sort of foreseen the conclusion of this group of activists' efforts to save the forest. She dies in their kind of the act that they're attempting to, the activism that they're attempting to undertake in the novel. Powers writes of Mimi, looking into Olivia's face as her life fades, quote, "As clearly as if she speaks the words out loud, she puts the idea into Mimi's skull. Something's wrong. I've been shown what happens, and this isn't it." Olivia transmits to Mimi precisely the frustration and failure that consumes Macbeth when he comes to the conclusion that the signals of nature have all been meaningless. The tragedy forces the characters to scatter around the country and to start new lives, each of their idealism shattered by the violence that marked their failure. Mimi could have taken the lesson that her father did, the lesson that Macbeth did, the lesson that she detected in the eyes of Olivia as she watched her die, but she chooses another path. Instead of hiding from the signals of nature, the mysterious communicativeness of consciousness, she dives into it as we see it in the scenes of the career she builds after the traumatic events that led her to sell the scroll of the Arhats and start a new career. This new career is as sort of a tantric therapist who is doing a sort of stare therapy where she looks into the eyes of her patients for long periods of time. And Stephanie is one of those patients. Stephanie bows her head. She sits up and they try again. It happens often, this false start. No one suspects how hard it is to hold another's gaze for more than 3 seconds. A quarter minute, and they're in agony. Introverts and extroverts, dominants and submissives alike. Scopophobia hits them all. Fear of seeing and being seen. A dog will bite if you stare at it too hard. People will shoot you. And though she has looked for hours into the eyes of hundreds of people, though she has perfected the art of endurance staring, Mimi feels a tinge of fear herself, even now, gazing into the skittering eyes of Stephanie, who blushes a little, powers through the shame, and settles down. Mimi has become a therapist working in a type of tantra based on maintaining eye contact. She's dismissing the human narratives, eschewing the anxieties of our need to know, to arrange the world into consumable stories, and looking right into the eyes of another being without precondition. She's basking in the sublimity of another being, allowing the signals of nature to pour over her without making demands. It is not that life, that nature, is full of meaningless signals, it is that the complexity of those signals is great, and we are small. In looking at the Arhats beside the witches, and at the parallel paths of Macbeth and Hwee, or perhaps even more to the point, at the generations that exceed them in the form of Banquo's offspring, who finally constitute the royal lineage that evades Macbeth, or Mimi Ma, who attains something akin to the peace that eluded her father, we can begin to see how the breadth of nature's timescale diminishes the temporal ambitions of any one life, and perhaps makes the very notion of utopia a foolish pursuit of stagnation amidst a dynamic and unfolding material world. Thank you very much. Hope everyone is well, and hope to see you all in Murcia next year.